All right, everybody, welcome back. Here we are, Wednesday's lecture, moving on to breathing regulation. I want to thank everybody when we start this for turning in all those awesome questions. I was surprised with how many great questions I got. So I'm going to try and go over those first in the lecture today. Then we'll move on to a little bit of a review to make sure we're caught up from our last lecture. And then we'll go on to how your breathing is regulated at rest. So, right now, with everybody sitting in front of their computers, why do you breathe in when you breathe in? Why do you breathe out when you breathe out? So, we'll talk about a couple of different factors that are involved there. And then we'll review how not to pass out underwater. It's a great little example of how our breathing is regulated overall and how you can really mess that up if you overdo it on some of your hyperventilation beforehand. Okay, so let's get started. Here's the questions. Super good one. And I'm going to kind of go a little bit in depth when we get into this one right here. The question is, given the importance of iron in red blood cells to oxygen transport during endurance exercise, is there an influence of menstrual cycle on endurance performance? Thinking that, hey, you have blood loss during your menstrual cycle, so is there a potential reduction in your ability to carry oxygen during that time? And the second part of that is for premenopausal women, women who are still having regular periods, should they supplement at higher doses than men because of this red blood cell turnover? Okay, so let's get into the first part of that question first. Okay, when women are going through their menstrual cycle, is there a reduction in endurance exercise performance? So this question caused me to go to where I always go, which is PubMed, and look for some research articles on this. So let's bring up our first article right here. Look at this: effects of the menstrual cycle on exercise performance. Pretty great. Good title to an article that is going to address exactly the question we are asking ourselves. And also, the PDFs of both of these journal articles will be available under the files after lecture today because you can totally nerd out on some of this stuff. There's some really great science in here. This first one is a review article, meaning that the author of this took a bunch of different articles and kind of smashed them together into a bunch of different sections related to menstrual cycle and exercise performance. So let's go down to the section that's really important to us because they talk about strength sports, they talk about some anaerobic sports, but we're talking about endurance sports because we're talking about oxygen transport. We've already covered anaerobic sports in previous sections, so let's go to where we're talking about right now in lecture. Okay, so if we zoom past all this information right here, I've highlighted the important part. This is in this section right here titled Plasma Volume, Hematocrit, and Hemoglobin Concentration. So during the menstrual cycle, do we see changes? And the statement right down here is that no change over the menstrual cycle in hematocrit, hemoglobin concentration, and plasma volume changes during exercise. So over the menstrual cycle, a couple of studies have looked at this and they haven't necessarily found changes in hemoglobin or hematocrit. So despite the fact that women going through their menstrual cycle are going to be losing blood, there does not seem to be an effect overall on what's happening within the red blood cells and in the plasma volume compartment in general. Basically, if you have enough iron supplemented in your iron pool to start, you're going to be able to keep up with that need to increase your red blood cell production despite the fact that you are losing some blood. Now, if we move a little bit further onto this, we look at the really important question here of what about maximal oxygen consumption? If we're seeing changes potentially in blood volume and body water during the menstrual cycle, do we see changes in maximal oxygen consumption? And if you look here in summary, most recent research suggests the menstrual cycle does not affect VO2 max, and we got a little bit of an error there with the different symbols, but overall, we do not have a change in VO2 max. So, part number one of that question, given the importance, if we go back to our file, let's see if I can do this guy. Fantastic. Part number one, no change in X performance due to menstrual cycle. Okay? The second part has to do with altitude because that's what we've just been talking about. Should women supplement at higher doses than men because of this red blood cell turnover? And this, we go into a different article. And this is a really, really cool article as well. So let's go back to this guy, and we'll go to our second one. This is a quick letter to the editor in the Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport. And basically what they did was they created something called a regression tree, which if you haven't taken advanced statistics at this point, you're probably not going to understand. But basically what they're looking at is the influence of one variable on another variable. And what they were looking at here was the influence of iron supplementation on a change in your hemoglobin concentration, because that's what's carrying the oxygen here. So what they did was they had this really cool figure right here. And if you look at their 178 people that were in this study overall, and this took place over in Australia. And what they did is they looked at, okay, if our ferritin level low at the beginning, pre, I know this is a little bit hard to see here, but that says pre, okay? Actually, let me zoom in. Here we go. Okay, if our ferritin level pre was greater than 100, so high ferritin to start with, what they did was they gave people either two doses, no dose, or a supplement dose of 105 milligrams per day. And if we look, okay, 14 people got the low dose and 31 people got the higher dose. And if we look at the changes in their hemoglobin concentration, that's these numbers right here, we see that the group that got the dose of 105 actually had, it looks like, a little bit larger change. They went up by 3.4 grams per deciliter versus our group that got the no dose, and they only went up by 1.2 when moving to altitude. Okay, and then if we further break this down and we say, okay, well, what if we take these people who are all above 100 and we say, okay, the people who are really, really high, who are over 133 versus the people who were between 100 and 133. And what we see here is we get the people who were a little bit lower to have a bigger response. And that makes sense. The people whose ferritin is already at 133, there's not much room for them to get any more hemoglobin from moving to altitude in that erythropoiesis stimulation that you have there. So we get a bigger stimulus from here. Okay? Now, we're not really worried about these people who are starting with high ferritin because we know they're already in pretty good shape. But if we move over to the people who have low ferritin to start with, okay, these would potentially be people who need this supplementation. Well, we gave them two different doses, 105 and 210 milligrams per day. 132 people in this group right here whose ferritin level started a little bit low. Well, if you look here, we look at the dosing schematic. If we gave him 105, they gained about 3.3 milligrams per deciliter of hemoglobin. If we gave him 210, there was 4.1. So a little bit of benefit of having the higher dosing scheme here. But if we really want to look, who gets the most benefit from this? These are people whose ferritin level is really low to start with. If you're less than 20, getting that 210 improves you by 7 milligrams per deciliter. So, let's tie this back to where we started with our question. Should premenopausal women supplement at higher doses than men because of this red blood cell turnover? And the answer here is it depends. Because we can't make a blanket statement. It's going to depend on your iron stores. Some women, when they move to altitude, are going to be maybe borderline anemic before they go there. Specifically, borderline iron anemic, meaning that their anemia is due to low iron concentration. For them, yeah, they should get that 210 milligrams per day, for sure. But some women, before they move to altitude, they might be in that other group that we looked at that had the ferritin levels above 100 milligrams per deciliter when they started. So should they really get a high dose? From what it shows on that decision tree, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. So it depends on resting ferritin levels. I'm sorry I can't give you a nice, round answer to say, okay, absolutely, yeah, if you're a female athlete and you're moving to a place of high altitude, absolutely you should take this. But what it seems like you should look at is maybe look into going to your doctor and getting a blood test for ferritin. If your ferritin comes back low, that might be a reason to talk to your doctor about potentially supplementing, because there's a lot of side effects with iron supplementation. You can have some GI effects, and you can also have some liver effects too. So you don't want to just start taking iron, even though you can get it in the grocery store, just because you think it's going to improve your ability to make red blood cells. You want to make sure you talk to your doctor about that and have the blood test beforehand to make sure that you're going to be a responder. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, let's move on. Can you clarify if the graph we drew on Monday's lecture was about live high, train high, or live high, train low? Absolutely. I was a little bit wishy-washy on this, so I'm glad somebody brought this up, because we had our figure, and we can zoom in here. There we go, time and performance. And remember, we draw a figure that looked like this, and this was when you are at sea level. And then we showed the sharp decline, and then kind of an incline back to normal. And then we said this was when we were at altitude, not the restaurant downtown in Laramie. Can't go there right now. We're all staying in our homes. This is when these athletes move to higher altitude. Okay. Then we showed this little bump for about 7 days. Okay. When you move back to sea level. And the important part here is that this section, let's change our color, is related to live high, train low. So even though these athletes in this figure were living at altitude, okay, they were traveling down, and they were living in an area that had a big mountain that they kind of lived on top of, and then they would drive about 90 minutes from that location down to the bottom of the mountain when they wanted to do their higher intensity training sessions, and they would do that 1 to 2 times a day for the course of the study. Whoa, not so much fun. Okay, so yes, live high, train low is what this figure interprets right here. So that's what we were talking about when we were talking about this figure. So thanks to the person who sent that question in. Next, what makes someone a responder or a non-responder? Do you know beforehand if you're going to be a responder or a non-responder? Second part of this question, is it just luck? And the answer to this is yes, it is just luck. And that luck may be based on your starting condition, okay? So a person who is very, very well trained going into this altitude exposure, they have a smaller window of improvement that they may be able to get. And by decreasing their exercise performance in the beginning stages of that time at altitude, you might actually be hurting their exercise performance and all, okay? Also, a person could have relatively low levels of ferritin, just like we talked about. So by moving them to higher altitude, they're not going to get the same change in hemoglobin that's going to improve their oxygen transport. So those are just a couple of things that might play into being a responder or a non-responder. Are you really, really fit to start? Do you have low ferritin that's not really necessarily going to enable you to make more red blood cells? Because despite the fact that, okay, we could say, hey, if you got low ferritin, we'll just give you a supplement, that doesn't always work as well. Taking a supplement, every supplement has something called bioavailability. Just because you eat something does not necessarily mean it's going to be incorporated into your cells. Some people are better than others at incorporating the iron in your diet or in an iron supplement into red blood cells. So just because you take an iron supplement doesn't mean you're going to make more red blood cells if that stimulus is there. Okay, it's going to help in general. On average, it'll help, but that doesn't mean for every single person. Okay, so that's how we have responders and non-responders. Number 4, can you clarify the improvement while training at altitude prior to competition at altitude? Okay, there's a term here that I want to bring up. And this is one that we talk about all the time when we're writing our research papers. The word here is attenuate, all right? It's a really kind of strange word, and what this means is limit, okay? So attenuate the decrease. So When we improve our ability to perform at high altitude by going to that location 2 to 3 weeks beforehand and getting some of the altitude benefits, increased red blood cells, increased plasma volume, those sorts of things over time, we attenuate the decrease. So when I talked about the marathon example, what I said was, okay, regular Dr. Johnson, his exercise performance is actually going to go down a little bit. He's not going to race his PR at this site. But if I didn't do that, it would have been even worse. So the improvement here is basically I'm attenuating the decrease in performance by going to high altitude beforehand. That's what that improvement means. It does not mean that by going to altitude beforehand, I'm going to be better than I was at sea level. Not at all. Okay? So will we still classify this as an improvement? Absolutely, because my place in that race will be better than it would have been if I didn't do that. So that's an improvement as far as I'm concerned. Okay? Number 5. Is it better to take iron supplements at altitude? Would they be less effective if taken at sea level? Does anemia play a role in their effectiveness? Okay, so I'm going to look at parts 1 and 3 of this question first. Is it better to take iron supplements at altitude? And does anemia play a role in their... Actually, let's just take number 1. Is it better to take iron supplements at altitude? And the answer to this one right here is yes. The reason it's better to take iron supplements at altitude is because there's a stimulus for red blood cell production. When you move to altitude, your partial pressure of oxygen goes down, and remember, that's going to be sensed in the brain. We're going to be talking about this a little bit today. If it's sensed in the brain, the stimulus is, hey, we're going to upregulate your secretion of erythropoietin, EPO, and if you have more EPO, your bone marrow is going to make more red blood cells. Fantastic. So is it better to take iron supplements at altitude? Yes. Would they be less effective if taken at sea level? Yes. For the same reason, there's less stimulus. For the most part, people's diets are able to supply the red blood cells or the iron necessary to create those red blood cells at sea level. However, if you were anemic, iron supplement or iron deficiency anemia, would that play a role in their effectiveness? And the answer to this is yes as well. Okay? If you had iron deficiency associated anemia, remember there's multiple different types, so your anemia might not necessarily be related to your ability to take iron from your diet and put it into red blood cells, but if it was that specific type of anemia, yes, if you had iron deficiency associated anemia and you took iron supplements, your ability to transport red blood cells would improve, and especially if you were going to higher altitude. Last one, a nice applied question. I really like this question because it gets at, hey, all right, you're telling me all this information about altitude and training. What if I live in Laramie and I go home after 3 weeks of training in Laramie to about an altitude of 5,000 feet? So that could be like Fort Collins, that could be somewhere else in Wyoming. Will there be physiological benefits? Will I get the benefits when I go down to 5,000 feet? And the answer here is nope. And I'm sorry to say that. And the reason that we have no benefit of having moving down to 5,000 feet is we're still above threshold. Basically, the difference between 7,200 feet and 5,000 feet is not enough. You're not going to get a big enough jump in that partial pressure of oxygen to really utilize, if we're thinking about our oxygen dissociation curve and our partial pressure here in Laramie is right here. Our partial pressure of oxygen at 5,000 feet is only going to be a little bit higher. Do we get much extra hemoglobin saturation by moving up that 2,000 feet? No. But if we move down to sea level right here, now that's where you're going to start to see a little bit of a benefit of having that additional partial pressure. So the reason that only going down to 5,000 feet won't really make that much of a difference and you won't be able to realize the benefit you've gotten from being in Laramie is that the partial pressure of oxygen is just not different enough to realize those changes. Okay? Does that mean that you won't notice any difference? You might notice a small difference, but if you went down to sea level, you would really see the difference. The Other question about this is, let's flip it around. What if I come to 5,000 feet before I go and race in Laramie? What if I go to a place that's kind of close, but not that much? The problem with 5,000 feet is it's not high enough. Generally, the cutoff, they say, for a lot of these changes that you see due to altitude acclimation, it's about 6,000 feet. So you have to be above 6,000 feet for you to realize some of those increases in hemoglobin. So 5,000 feet, not quite good enough. You really got to be a little bit higher for that to happen, okay? Whew. Great questions. Keep them coming. If you got more from this lecture, I want to hear them because that's going to help us go through and really help you guys retain some of the information. Like I said, you get bonus points every time you send them in, and you have the opportunity to send in 4 questions. And we got, probably about 7 or 8 lectures left here, so make sure you get on those as soon as you can. Okay, let's move on to our review. This is from last lecture. Describe how Live High, Train Low endurance training may improve an athlete's performance. Okay, let's do this. Living high, increased, whoops, that's not an arrow. If you increase your hemoglobin by living high, that's a great thing, because you can carry more oxygen. Part 2, train low with increased hemoglobin. Increased training impulse. Okay, and the example we used for this last class was, if I could run 10 400s in 60 seconds before I started Live High, Train Low, now after a few weeks of Live High, Train Low, now I can run 10 400s in 58 seconds. So I'm doing the same amount of work in less time. Therefore, the training impulse is going to go up. So the way that Live High, Train Low improves an athlete's performance is you enable this increased training impulse, and therefore you get increased adaptation. So your muscles are going to change more, and your oxygen delivery system, all these things are going to change more if you increase the amount of work that person is doing during all of their training sessions. Okay, you can't just live high and train low like one session and think you're going to get the benefits. You got to live high and train low for a while to make sure that you're getting those adaptations. The analogy I would use here is it would be like using steroids one time. If you use one injection of steroids, you're not going to get that much of an overall benefit in your strength. Because what the benefit of steroids comes from is you take them all the time, and every time you go to the gym, you can do more work. And if I can do more work for 6 months, guess what? I'm going to get huge. If you can live high and train low for a long period of time, guess what? Those training impulse goes up, and your adaptations over time are going to go up as well. And hopefully, performance. Because remember, performance is more than just VO2 max. Yes, if we had 3 people and we know that one person's VO2 max was 60 milliliters per kilogram, the next person was 50 milliliters per kilogram, and the last person on the list is going to be 40 milliliters per kilogram, if we set them out on a 5K and beforehand we knew this information, we could probably predict pretty well that that person with the 60 mLs per kg is going to be the person who's going to win that race. But when you get into college athletics, high school athletics, professional athletics, people are pretty much maxed out. They're going to have VO2 maxes that are not 60, 50, 40. It's going to be 80, 78, 76. Okay? So we have a much narrower range of VO2 maxes because everybody's really well trained. Now, if you have those smaller differences in VO2 max, now our ability to predict a winner goes out the window. Because even in something as simple as like a swimming race, somebody swimming the 1500, or a running race, somebody running a 5K, where we think it's all about aerobic capacity. No, there are things associated with that are outside of that. There's a lot of psychology. Go talk to Dr. Reddy for 5 minutes and try and convince him that it's only about your ability to transport oxygen. he will throw you out of his office in about 5 minutes, I'm sure. Okay, so there's a lot of psychology involved there, and there are other intangibles that are related to performance besides oxygen transport. But in general, if we want to improve one part of that performance, which is our ability to transport oxygen and the training impulse associated with that, living high and training low can help that. Let's move on. What is the stimulus that results in total body increased oxygen carrying capacity due to the live high, train low? Okay, and that's just our increased hemoglobin. That's our stimulus. If we have more stimulus, basically we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're hoping that that progression happens down the line. Last one right here, and this is related to one of our questions that we had from the last lecture, so you should be able to answer this one. If Dr. Derek Smith is planning to race his friend from New Orleans at the Mexico City Marathon, if they both show up 24 hours before the race, who is more physiologically prepared and why? And we know the answer to that is Dr. Smith, because he lives here in Laramie, while his friend is from New Orleans. And we know New Orleans is actually, some parts of it are below sea level. Okay, so if they both show up to that Mexico City Marathon beforehand, Dr. Smith is going to be way more prepared because his starting hemoglobin concentration is going to be a little bit higher than his buddies, and hopefully he'll be able to do better in that race and have less of a decrement than his friend. Cool. So that covers our questions and a review from last lecture. Let's move on to some of the new stuff. We're talking about breathing regulation right here. And specifically, we want to know what chemical variables in the body, not is the body, come on, get your game together here, in the body is attempting, to regulate by altering breathing. Okay? Oh, wait. No, that's right. Disregard that. What chemical variables is the body attempting to regulate by altering breathing frequency? Okay, that sentence actually makes sense. So, what we're looking at is 3 things in general, okay? These are in the body. Number 1, partial pressure of CO2. If we look at our figure over here, there we go. There's our CO2 right there. Here's our CO2. Okay. What else do we have? Well, we have pH. Okay, cool. Let's put pH down here at number 3. And the last one is partial pressure of oxygen. But the biggest driver of this overall is going to be our carbon dioxide. Okay, that's going to be the thing that drives us to change our ventilation or our breathing frequency in general. So let's take a look at this flow chart over on the right hand side and kind of follow this along. So we have a person who has decreased their ventilation. They have started breathing more slowly. Okay, what's going to happen in that person? Let's take a red line and kind of follow this down. Okay, let's go a little bit. With decreased ventilation, you're going to get increased arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And let's think about that. If you are breathing less frequently, your ability to off-gas or breathe out that carbon dioxide goes down. That means the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your alveoli is going to go up. If the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your alveoli goes up, that means the gradient between your blood and your alveoli is going to narrow, and you're going to pull less carbon dioxide out of your blood. Okay, so if there's less being pulled out, well then let's go over to this branch right here, and we see that our plasma carbon dioxide is going to go up. Okay, that makes sense. If we're breathing less off, that carbon dioxide has to stay somewhere. It's going to stay in the plasma. If it stays in the plasma, then it's going to reach our cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. And that crosses the blood-brain barrier and is going to bring it to the medulla oblongata, where our respiratory center is located. In that respiratory center, spinal neurons are then going to be activated to say, hey, there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide right now. We better act on our respiratory muscles to stimulate some ventilation. So if we slow down our breathing, our plasma carbon dioxide goes up. That plasma carbon dioxide is sensed in the brain, and the brain sends a signal to our respiratory muscles, our intercostals, and our diaphragm to say, hey, dummy, breathe faster. Okay, let's go to the other side. Because of this, we have a decrease in pH. Why does blood pH go down? Well, it all goes back to our carbon dioxide. Why does that happen? Well, let's do the math. If we have an increase in CO2 in our blood, how is carbon dioxide carried in the blood? Think back to a couple lectures ago. Well, carbon dioxide is going to be carried... Oh, I drew the wrong type of arrow here. Hang on. Because we know that it's a reversible reaction into our carbonic acid, into HCO3 minus plus our hydrogen atom. Okay, so if we have more CO2 in the blood, guess what we're also going to have more of? More hydrogen ions in the blood. If we have more hydrogen ions in the blood, let's see, do a purple line here, all the way over to here. There we go. If we have more hydrogen ions, we're also going to have a lower pH. Remember, those two things are inversely proportional. Okay, so pH went down. If pH goes down, let's get back to our red pen here. Chemoreceptors located in the aortic and carotid bodies are going to be activated. Carotid bodies right here. Aortic bodies right over the arch in the aorta of your heart. Believe it or not, you have chemoreceptors located in those areas specifically. Okay? If they sense that blood pH has gone down, they are going to activate some afferent sensory neurons, remember, going towards the brain, and activate that same respiratory center in the medulla. And once that respiratory center gets activated, now those spinal cord neurons can send that efferent message to the respiratory muscles to increase your ventilation. So we're seeing two ways here where decreased ventilation can increase your ventilation in the long run. If that decreased ventilation results in increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hopefully that increased ventilation will then increase or decrease your partial pressure of carbon dioxide and therefore slow this. You have this nice negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so once we regulate that partial pressure of carbon dioxide, then that increased ventilation will stop. So if we had to kind of think about the order of importance of these three guys right here, we'd say carbon dioxide is number 1, pH is number 2, and oxygen coming in at a distant third. And we always think about, okay, oxygen is the most important because that's the one that we think about when we're thinking about breathing and the ability to keep on doing our skeletal muscle contractions. But when it really comes down to it, our body is more closely monitoring carbon dioxide and pH. Okay. What about the physical factors? So we talked about the kind of the chemical factors, but there also have to be physical factors that influence breathing as well. All right. Let's get a little bit smaller so we can kind of mark this out. What physical factors influence our breathing mechanics? Okay, let's start now with number 1. Breathing begins. Specifically, inspiration. Okay, and this is going to be sensed stretch receptors. And if you were designing this to work, these stretch receptors to work, in response to breathing inspiration, where would you put them? Well, you'd put them in the two things that are stretching during this time. Your intercostals, they're stretching apart, and your diaphragm, okay? Diaphragm stretching as well. Fantastic. So if those two things happen, then once those stretch receptors are activated, they are going to send an afferent signal to the medulla. Okay? Just like we saw before with the chemosensation, now with our stretch reception, we're going to have a signal sent to the medulla because we know that's where that breathing center is located. Okay? Let's move on. Number 3. Now that efferent message back. Okay, so that's the afferent message. The efferent message back to breathing muscles inhibits inspiration. Basically what's happening as you're breathing, your chest cavity and your thorax in general, the volume in there is going like this. As that starts to happen, okay, the message goes to your brain to say, whoa, that volume's getting bigger. I better slow that down. You don't have infinite ability to expand your chest cavity. There's a maximum amount of that. So as that is stretching, you kind of have this kind of intuitive system that's saying, hey, if we're stretching, we're going to have to stop stretching soon. So let's start inhibiting whatever stimulus is causing us to enhance that volume in the first place. Okay? And the analogy I use here is, have you guys ever seen those kind of those dipping birds that there'll be water in a fountain that's like pouring into like one of the bird's beaks, okay? And that water's coming in, the water's coming in, the water's coming in, and eventually the bird dips down and dumps all that water out. That's what's happening here. As we're stretching, that inhibition signal is increasing, 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 and eventually gets to a point where it goes, oh, that's too much. All that inhibition has happened, and therefore that's when we're going to exhale. So, number 4, after inhibition, the signal for inhibition is greater than the signal for inspiration. You'll exhale. When you exhale, exhalation, you remove all of the inhibition. So just like that bird, when it dips down, it removes all that water from its beak. What's going to happen? It's going to pop right back up and start filling again. So in this case, the second breath starts. Inhalation begins again. So what we've done here is we've talked about 2 different ways that breathing is regulated. If we kind of wanted to put these in order of operations, this would be number 1 down here because this is our normal breathing cycle. Inhale, exhale. It just has to do with the stretch in your lung, or the stretch in your intercostals, the stretch in your diaphragm, telling you when to expand your chest cavity and when to contract it. The second part has to do with a little bit of the more fine tuning. As we notice that change in partial pressure of carbon dioxide change, can we increase that ventilation or decrease? Okay? So, we just talked about chemical thresholds overall. So how does this influence your ability to breathe underwater? Okay? So, let's just draw a little figure, and how can we influence this overall? So let's do this. Yep, I got the right color. This is the concentration of CO2 in the blood. in millimeters per mercury. Okay? And what we'll do is we'll do 20, 30, 40, 50. And we know, let's make this nice and thin. There we go, perfect. 50 is about our threshold for breathing. If you've ever gone underwater and tried to hold your breath, and eventually you get that moment where you're just like, I have to take a breath right now, the reason that you're feeling that way is because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide has probably reached 50 millimeters of mercury in your blood. You have that immediate stimulus to want to breathe immediately. And what did we talk about? So let's go to blue. Let's increase this just a little bit in size. Normal breathing, okay? So if we have in blue our normal breathing, remember we said we start our normal partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is normally around 40 millimeters of mercury. And what's going to happen if we go underwater and we can't breathe and exchange that air in our alveoli to help breathing that carbon dioxide off, just like we showed above, that concentration of carbon dioxide is going to slowly increase. So if we have a line from here, it's probably going to look something like this. And if we have our time on the x-axis here, we say, well, at this point right here, let's say that's about 30 seconds, this person is going to need to take a breath. What would happen if they didn't? Well, their carbon dioxide would go above that threshold, and if they didn't bring it back down and didn't take a breath, well, then the body would try and do what it does when that carbon dioxide gets out above that threshold level. It makes you lose consciousness, because basically if you fell down, your blood pressure would regulate, your breathing would go back to normal, and hopefully that would save your life. But the body is not necessarily assuming that you're underwater when this happens. So as you can see, a loss of consciousness underwater would probably be a pretty darn bad thing. Okay? We're going to talk about how that can change a little bit in a minute. So the second part of this is, well, what if you take what if we do a little bit of hyperventilation beforehand? Not a lot, but we do some of those deep, kind of quicker breaths to help bring the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our alveoli closer to the atmosphere. If we do that, we increase the gradient between our blood and our alveoli. We can pull more carbon dioxide out of the blood. We can breathe more carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere, and then bring our carbon dioxide concentration, or partial pressure in our blood, down a little bit lower. Let's say we bring it down to 30 in the blood. Well, that's good. And then what we do is we try to go underwater and do the exact same thing. Well, as we go underwater, we're going to be exercising or creating carbon dioxide at the same rate as when we were on the blue line. So the slope of this line will be identical to the one above it. That looks pretty good right there. Right? Those lines look pretty parallel. What we see here is our improvement. Basically, we have depressed our starting point where we went underwater to enable us to hold our breath for a little bit longer. Here's the time right here where we're going to need to take a breath, and that might be like 45 seconds before we take a breath. And the reason that you can hold your breath for a little bit longer is not because a lot of people think when you do that beforehand, you're stretching out your lungs and you're enabling yourself to hold more air in your lungs. That doesn't do anything. That has nothing to do with it. The reason that taking those fast, deep breaths beforehand enables you to hold your breath a little bit longer is because you're bringing that partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your blood down. If you start lower and produce carbon dioxide at the same rate, guess what? It's going to take you longer to get to that threshold of 50. So let's finish off with one last thing. And why do people black out underwater? Most of the time, it's not because you hit this 50 millimeters of mercury and you just are able to repress and say, I'm not going to take a breath. That is mostly the reason that they pass out is not because of that. Remember, we said that the body is monitoring three things: carbon dioxide, pH, which are related based on our carbonic acid right there, and oxygen. All three of those factors can cause you to take a breath. We've talked about the importance of carbon dioxide. We haven't talked about when oxygen comes into play. So why do people black out when they're underwater? All right. So let's look at this guy first. Aha. This line right here. So our oxygen is right there. It's on the red line. Let's do this. There's our oxygen level. There's our CO2 level, okay, right there. And what this is right here, look at this. High CO2 triggers breathing. That's exactly what we just went over, okay? So what we would say with that one is that's about 50 millimeters Hg for our partial pressure of CO2. But also, if we go to our red, or let's make our red pen, low O2 triggers breathing. So we have two different types of thresholds here. We have a high CO2 and a low oxygen. Cool. So under a normal breath, let's just do this right here. Let's follow along this line. Let's go just a little bit bigger. Okay. So what's going to happen, here's our normal breathing. We're not underwater yet. We have that nice partial pressure of oxygen, which is up there. Remember, that's like 100, okay? And as you dive, here we go. That oxygen partial pressure is going down. We're using that oxygen. We are not able to offload the CO2. We're not able to replenish the hemoglobin. So that partial pressure of oxygen is dropping. And guess what? We get to this point right here. Let's switch over. Let's go to our carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide at start is like 40 millimeters of mercury. We're breathing normally. We start our dive just like we showed before. That carbon dioxide concentration goes up. We have reached our high carbon dioxide triggering breathing. We are now going to start breathing at this point. Even if we held our breath for a little bit longer, guess what would happen? Here we go. We're going to go back down to normal breathing again. And our oxygen partial pressure is going to go back up as well. Nothing bad has happened. We started breathing because we reached that trigger. Okay. Oh, sorry. Low O2 triggers not breathing, blackout. So when that oxygen concentration gets really low, you can black out from that. You're not going to get the same stimulus to breathe from that. You're just going to kind of skip that breathing stimulation and go right to passing out so that everything can go back to normal. Pass out, blood pressure goes back to normal because you lay down, everything can equilibrate, and you start breathing normally again. Hopefully that oxygen concentration goes up. Okay. So let's see what happens following hyperventilation. So in this phase right here, we are going to hyperventilate. So we'll use our carbon dioxide in blue, and we'll do our oxygen concentration in red. Okay? What we're going to do is during our hyperventilation, we started at our 100, we're going to get a small little increase. Not much. A small increase in your partial pressure of oxygen when you're going underwater and you're hyperventilating. This is... But what we know is going to happen, let's make this a little bit. Here's our normal 40. We're going to get a big decrease in our partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our blood when we do that hyperventilation. Okay? So, as we go underwater, same as before, carbon dioxide is going to go up just like this. There we go. And as we said before, this is the point, urgent need to breathe. Right there. That's when that's going to happen because that carbon dioxide has reached that point. The chemoreceptors are going to say, hey, you need to breathe. Your pH has gone down. We need to breathe. Okay. But remember, as that carbon dioxide is going up, what's also happening is your oxygen is going down. And if we understand that this axis right here is time, what we can now see right there, we have reached the O2 blackout zone before we have reached the urgent need to breathe. Above, we saw that we reached the carbon dioxide triggering breathing before we reached the O2 blackout zone because we didn't do any hyperventilation beforehand. But if we hyperventilate a whole lot beforehand and get that carbon dioxide partial pressure down, what it does is it changes the dynamics. If you look at the angles of these lines right here, this guy, and this guy are pretty similar. The slopes of those are pretty much the same. What we've done is we've changed, and if we look at the slopes of our carbon dioxide lines, right? This guy and this guy are pretty much the same. What we've done is just change this starting point to be a little bit lower. If you change that starting point to be a little bit lower without changing the starting point too much of our oxygen concentration, well, then you mess up the order in which you normally hit those. The body is designed so that you're going to hit your need to breathe before you pass out. You're going to get a stimulus to say, hey, I need to breathe before you fall over. But if you hyperventilate too much, you could actually reach that blackout zone before you reach the need to breathe. And that's why, especially if you look at some of these like Navy SEAL training things where they have people going underwater and having to swim like 100 yards underwater, people can pass out during that. And not to say that they're not thinking underwater, hey, I'm going to hold my breath, I'm not going to breathe, even though I feel a little bit of stimulus. But the reason they don't have that urgent need, that reflex that they can't even override, is because they have hyperventilated beforehand for the most part. Okay? So let's stop there for today. We'll move on. Remember, send me some of those questions. I'll get to them at the beginning of next lecture, and I will see you next on Friday.